He is in his own right an educator, an author, a scholar, a researcher, and an innovator. He has a particular focus on media and how digital technologies and new media are affecting our society and how we as individuals learn. Please welcome John Palfrey.
Tyler, thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Tyler, thank you for the introduction and the great job moderating all day. Randy and Ronnie and the whole team, thank you so much for putting on this conference. Congratulations on 10 years. It's really a very exciting place to be today. And I also wanted to start by thanking all of you for being indoors on such a beautiful day. You could be out on that golf course playing, but you were in here talking about big ideas and have set aside part of your day, or all of your day, to be a part of this. So thank you for being such a great audience. I have loved this day and learned so much. It's one of the great things about my job as president of a foundation is I get to hear great ideas all the time, but I think we've had a huge treat today. I'm afraid I cannot shoot myself out of a rocket. I do not have my daughter here to interview me, nor do I have very exciting slides, but I hope what I can provide in my 20 minutes or so is a dose of optimism. So I love the name of this conference, Imagine Solutions, thinking about solutions. I brought out one prop, which is, I don't know if you can see that, but this glass of water to me is definitely half full. So I see all of these problems as solutions to be solved. And I wanted to just take an example of one of the big complex problems that we have been talking about today and run it through some of the ways in which MacArthur Foundation, through its Fellows Program and otherwise, takes up this issue. But I also want to end actually focusing on in a slightly different way on the future and on some of the people I think are most promising to do something great about this issue of climate change. To be clear, my point is not actually about climate change per se. You could put a pandemic or other complex problem in its place. The issue really is, though, to think about the nature of the problems that we are facing today in this world. They are substantially, I think, more complex than problems of thousands of years ago in some ways, because of our interconnected economies, because of the way digital technologies work, because of the diversity of our planet and the way that it's growing, and many forms of science. So I actually think that speaks to the kinds of solutions that we need, which I do think are different than they were in the past. So that's just really the piece I want to underscore, is this notion of complexity and how it relates to the kinds of solutions that we need. The story that I was going to tell today begins with the founders of the foundation that I work at. These are John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur. John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur, like many of you, worked for much of their life in the north of the United States. They were in Chicago and made a lot of money in life insurance and other forms of insurance and banking. They then moved to Florida, spent a lot of their life in Florida, began investing in real estate, very well timed, in Palm Beach County and in Sarasota, and then in real estate in Manhattan. So they own about 7,700 apartments in Manhattan, the last of which we recently sold this fall. They also decided that at the end of their life, they would leave much of their money to charity. This was in the late 1970s, and they were the third richest family in America at the time. And they decided to leave behind about $1 billion to found the MacArthur Foundation, for which I'm very grateful. And their vision for this foundation was quite unusual, actually. It's not necessarily the right answer, but I'm the lucky beneficiary of it today, which is they said, in short, we made the money, you all figure out how to spend it. It was not a foundation that said, this is exactly what we want you to do. And I actually think going back to this idea of the complexity of the problems and the solutions that we need, that was itself a visionary act. It's an act of great trust that those of us who carry out that legacy will honor the kinds of things they wanted to do. But I think actually it was a very wise thing because it allows people to do things that are very creative in terms of the solutions that we support. MacArthur Foundation, since that time, has become most famous for what you saw in the video earlier and what Tyler referred to as the Genius Grants. We do not call it that. We officially call it the MacArthur Fellows Program. But in fact, of course, it is known as the Genius Grants. It's a wonderful program. Many of you have asked me as I've walked around this conference, how do I get one? Or how do I get one for my son? Or I got a nephew earlier. Some of you may have seen a movie called The Marriage Story that just came out. At the end of that, or partway through, somebody gets a MacArthur Award. My email has been flooded with people applying for the MacArthur Award since the movie had it involved. So I thought I would tell you how they actually come about. For a long time, it was quite secret as to how the MacArthur Fellows were awarded, and we've decided that secrecy is not necessarily a good thing. I can say today that I was one of the selectors for this program. I was not allowed at the time to say that I was one of the selectors, but when I was announced as president, they put it in the press release, so I figure I'm now free to say I was a selector. But there's a group of people who fulfill different roles. So we start off with a very large group of people who are nominators. So I know that in this room there are nominators who we've asked to send us ideas of creative, innovative people who might be worthy of this award. There's then a second set of people who are the peer reviewers. They are typically experts in the field, so there's some in medicine, there's some in the arts, and there's some in teaching and so forth. And then there's a smaller group of selectors who, and that was something I did, who then make the choices. They then send that on to the board and to me as the president to review and to make these awards. Running that whole process are a group of unbelievably brilliant people, the geniuses who choose the geniuses, if you will, an incredible staff who shepherds all of these nominations through to the end. And to stick with the story of climate change, it turns out that in this year, in 2019, when we awarded MacArthur Fellowships to 26 different people, and what that means, as Tyler said, is that they get $625,000 with no strings attached. We in fact say to them, we'll never call you again. We're very happy if you come back to the foundation or reunions and so forth, but the point is you can do anything you want with it, and we hope that you will do good in the world, that you will come up with creative solutions. When we did that this fall, at the end of our process, which goes in lots of different directions, Lin-Manuel Miranda, well before Hamilton and so forth, goes to brilliant scientists and so forth, that 4 out of the 26 people who got it this year were working on climate change. So I am guessing that if we scrolled back into the 1980s, that would not have been the case. Nor, perhaps, when John Dee and Catherine T. MacArthur were setting out the foundation, would they have guessed we need, in 2019, 4 climate scientists, artists, and so forth in order to address the world's problems. And I think this is part of that brilliance that they had, the brilliance to say, let's allow the people who are going to run this foundation 40-some years from now to be able to address today's problems. I would say, though, that this is not the only thing that MacArthur Foundation does. It's a funny element of my job, which is it's about 5% of our budget that goes to these fellowships, but is at least 95% of the renown of the foundation, by a lot. But the good news is we do have some other money that we can spend every year. And I want to talk a little about how we allocate that to something such as climate change. This is a change, I think, in philanthropy, which is that in recent years, MacArthur and other big foundations gave to lots and lots of things. We were recently doing grant making in as many as 50 countries and in as many as 17 areas. And we have reduced it to be much more concentrated on a series of things that we call big bets. And I'm actually more comfortable with this strategy because I think it means that we can bring more power to bear on immediate and urgent problems. Climate change is one, nuclear security is another. And these are done across the world, but in areas where we have expertise. Instead of being in 50 countries, we're in about 5 countries now. So in the case of climate change, we're in the United States, in India, and in China. And you might be able to guess the reason for that is these are the 3 largest emitting countries in the world for affecting climate change. United States remains the largest emitter per capita, but we are by no means the biggest emitter in the world. China and India have far surpassed us, and they're growing at a much faster rate. So the idea is to say we've set a goal, which is a big, crazy goal in the world, which is to say we want to keep the planet from rising more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. And we, in a big bet, are going to put lots of money every year into those people, those solution providers, who we think can do that in these 3 countries, in the United States, in India, and China. So think about the Fellows Program as go and do whatever you think is right to brilliant people with lots of promise. On another hand, what we're doing is giving money to people where we know what they're going to do with it, and they're going to be aiming toward a goal, this idea of strategic philanthropy, again, toward climate change. But recently, we've taken a slightly different look at the entire picture, and this is something that I was hoping to leave you with as well today, which is to say we have lots of things at our disposal beyond just being able to give out grants. So if you think about how might we all be part of a solution to something related to climate change, there are probably lots of things we can do. So remember I mentioned the MacArthur family having all those apartments and the land here in Florida. They also had a building in Chicago, which is the one we work in, called the Marquette Building. It's a 17-story building, one of the first skyscrapers in America. It's very beautiful. And we own this building and occupy it, and we're a landlord and so forth. Our building and the way that we operate in the world is another way that, of course, we can contribute to climate change. So we're doing things to green that building and make it more environmentally sound. That seems like an important thing that each of us can do toward this complex problem. But the other thing we realized, in addition to having a building, is, of course, we have a bunch of assets. As of the end of the year, we had about $7 billion in the endowment. Realize that's a little bit lower today after we heard from Ed. Sorry to say, but I guess that happens up and down. We also have made a commitment, in addition to that, to do something around impact investing. So you heard the water.org story this morning. We've decided to take, independent from the endowment itself, $500 million and to invest that in solutions that might be for-profits, they can be nonprofits, but the point is to take equity investments or debt that then allow these entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, to try to address things like climate change. And I think this is actually a very important aspect of what we are now doing. So if you think about the Genius Grant says, go do anything you want, unrestricted gifts to people. You think about those big bets as strategic philanthropy, giving big grants to people where you know exactly what they're going to do. We're now focused on saying to those who are investing in other ways, we'll give you equity capital or debt to go do something that would bring other solutions to bear in service of this climate change and other initiatives we had. And of course, this comes against the backdrop of lots of people doing this. I don't want to pretend at all that MacArthur Foundation is the innovator here. I think we're doing things ambitiously and well. But the world of sustainable investing, of course, is growing very, very quickly. And there are lots of things that get counted in that bucket. I will say that for us, the idea of sustainable investing broadly is actually too broad to think about it. So we prefer thinking about it in this other way, which is to consider a spectrum of the kinds of investments that we could make. So this is what I wanted to pause on for a second, which is I think that each of us could think about the ways that we could contribute to solving any of these problems and to figure out what our spread of tools might be, just as we do at the foundation. So on one end, on the far right side, where it says philanthropic grant making, that's obviously making grants, which I think is the right thing to do, and hopefully we all do that in our daily life, whether that's tithing 10% to our place of worship, or that's giving to the kinds of local charities and food banks that need it, or it's the kind of strategic things that we're talking about. That is crucial to keep our society working, of course. But also, I think, to think about what are the other ways in which we can use the assets that we have in order to make a big difference on something like climate change. And for us, that means saying we're going to pull some money aside and invest it in kinds of things that philanthropy has not typically put money into, like these for-profits or these nonprofits that are taking equity and debt. And now, the most recent conversation, and the big conversation, which we do not yet have an answer on, to be clear, is thinking about the endowment itself. So if we have not quite $7 billion in the bank, which, if you think about how the math works, the IRS says we need to spend about 5% of that a year, so we have about $350 million a year to spend on grants and on administrative things. If you think about that $7 billion, how do we invest that money, and is it consistent with what we're trying to accomplish? And one of the tricky things that we are grappling with right now is that we are invested very, very broadly in the economy. Our philosophy, like most big endowments, and this is true of universities, it's true of big museums, it's true of high schools that have big endowments, is that they've tended to invest for the highest risk-adjusted returns, regardless of where that money is invested. Now, the complexity that we have at the moment is that we have investments in lots of things that we know from the science are not contributing to the climate change solutions, but in fact are part of the problem. And so one of the big questions that we've been asking ourselves is, as we look at all these tools that we have, is it inconsistent for us to be, say, in oil and gas exploration at the same time that we are giving grants to address climate change? And you may come down on one side or another of that debate, but that is something that is roiling through many of these big institutions, including our own, and I think is an important question for all of us to ask on our own. And I'm not positing what you should do, or even what will come out, but we are asking that hard question. pivot, if I might, to one other setting in my last couple of minutes. Before I was president of MacArthur Foundation, I had an unbelievably fun job, which was to be the head of a high school. I was head of a school called Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass. It's an amazing, wonderful place. It has 1,100 young people, and they come from all over the world. It's a need-blind school, so you apply, and if you are able to get in and do the work, regardless of whether you can pay, you get to come. And these kids are so fun, and they are so smart, and they are so able. If you ever need a dose of what will make you feel good about the world, the glass half full example, just go to one of these high schools. So one day, early on in my time as the head of school, you can imagine me sitting in a great office in New England in a classic New England fall day. Knock on the door. I guess they wrote an email to my assistant, but proverbial knock on the door, and in come a bunch of students who wanted to talk to me about climate change. I said, great, I'm interested in climate change. I'd worked for EPA for 3 years. I was ready for them. This was going to be good. Educational moment. And they sat on the couch in front of me, and I said, what's on your mind? And they said, well, Mr. Palfrey, we really want you to divest from the endowment in certain things that are affecting climate change. And I said, okay, we are plainly invested in companies that affect our climate. Tell me more. And they proceeded to give me an argument that wasn't a very good argument. In fact, it was a terrible argument. They had not rehearsed it very well, and it was straight off of a series of talking points, which, by the way, I had seen on the internet earlier. There was an organizer who had proposed to students to go around to their heads of school and their head of a university. And if you're wondering, Andover actually has about a $1.1 billion endowment, so it's a meaningful endowment, as many colleges and universities are. So it was a meaningful question, a meaningful amount of money, but their argument was just terrible. And they came in my office, and they were sort of meek about it, and I thought, okay, there are lots of responses to this. I could just run roughshod over them and say, this is a terrible argument, get out of here, or I could make it a teaching moment. So as I was listening to them make this really terrible argument, I said, okay, I'm going to tell them straight, but we're also going to make it a teaching moment. So I said to them, look, this was a terrible argument. You made a terrible argument. They were very surprised to have the head of school tell them they had made a terrible argument. I'm sure I was intimidating enough. They looked back at me, eyes big as saucers. I said, but it's okay. I'm going to give you another shot. Let me tell you what I will do, which is we have a board of trustees and an investment committee who have to make this decision. I am not the decision maker. I'm one of those trustees, but there are 22 trustees. But you are not going in there if you're going to be that bad. So here's your job. Actually go learn this, not from a bunch of talking points, but go learn the science and go learn this argument and make a better argument. And I'll put you in front of the board of trustees, and I'll put you in front of the investment committee, and you will be able to make your case. I don't know what's going to happen, but you will get a shot at this. So eyes still big as saucers. Okay, Mr. Palfrey, and they kind of go out of the room. A few weeks later, they came back when the trustees were on campus. They made their argument. I will say it was 10% better. It still wasn't especially good. It's a very complicated argument, right? So, we all need electricity. We need lots of things. And if you divest from what, and, what's the effect? They were okay. It was a little mediocre, but they improved, and that's important. And it turned out that at our school, there's a policy, and the policy says that we will divest, and we have divested from things, but only if there is a strong community consensus. And so what we on the board said, look, we will test this. We will go back out into the community and say, is there a consensus that we ought to divest from fossil fuel burning companies that consume fossil fuels? And if so, we will divest. We'll figure it out. It's complicated, but we'll figure it out. But we then ran a process where we put it in the school newspaper, and we ran a bunch of forums. And these kids were a little bit heroic, right, at this point, because they've prompted this great big discussion about climate. And the interesting part was there was not a community consensus that we ought to divest. And there are lots of reasons. So some people said, look, we spend our money principally on two things. We spend the money on scholarships to be a need-blind school, meaning that any kid anywhere in the world can come here, and we rely on endowment returns for that. And we pay our teachers very, very well, which we should, and shout out to the teachers and superintendents who are here today. Really important. And that's more important than whether we are invested in these things. And if you divest, you might have less to do this. Query as to whether that's true, but that was part of the discussion. Anyway, there was not a community consensus. And what we ended up doing was staying invested in those stocks. But we said we're going to do something else. We will make a climate action plan, and we will look at all the things that we could do, a little like that slide I had up before, all the other things that we could do to be making a difference. And some of that was educational, and some of that was our buildings. we managed to find a way to invest in a solar farm that was being developed, so all of our electricity for this high school came from solar energy and so forth, just as you might put solar panels on your home in Naples and be able to fuel your life that way. In any event, there are lots of things that we can do that might not be this divestment point. So as I come back around to the end of this, I am so excited to have been able to spend this time with all of you. And the reason is that I have spent the day thinking about a lot of solutions and all those things that we can do with the different tools that we have as individuals to address the most complex problems of our day. And I'm very grateful to be in partnership with all of you as we take them on. Thank you so much.
On the podium. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really good. Thank you very much.